It's concept of listen. And I always say, no, really, truly listen, and then learn, and only then can you lead. And the implication there is the genuine listening is important in that you really do hear people. It's not like a checkbox. And then the learning aspect adds a little angle that says, what did you hear? What did you think you heard? And go back to those same people. And then from that, you can get a real sense of where to go after that.
Oscar, it's great to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
I want to start at a place of love. I was reading, and maybe this is because of it related to me as a dad of daughters. I was reading about you and Jessica, and you wrote in your book that you see in her a few traits that you see in yourself, and that is tenacity and a refusal to give in no matter what. Can you tell me more about how Jessica shares those traits with you, and maybe even a story or two of when she put them to use?
Oh, gosh. These are always, your kids are everything, as you know, and you do the best you can to raise them and to lead by example, and hope that when they face the issues that life inevitably throws your way, they're able to respond in a way that's meaningful and helpful and less dramatic for them. And she's an incredibly gifted young lady. Her ability to rise above everything and put family first, and then when I use the word tenacity, when I was in the hospital, I mean, there was not a thing that was going to be done to me, a point of communication to the rest of the family that didn't go through her first. She did her research and her work. And so it was a great example of how she kind of takes over something with the full, the full support of the family. And conversely, if there's anyone ever deciding that they want to say something that's not so positive about the family, they have to face her first as well. But she's had a great career. She's now a mother of this incredible granddaughter that I also mentioned. And I love her ability to communicate in a crisp, clear way. She's given a couple of sets of remarks, my going away at United in front of thousands of people, and she gets up there and projects in a way that it's just such a proud moment. And the relation to me, and a lot of, obviously my kids, all our kids have a lot of us, but I think her desire to be family first, to communicate effectively, and just do it in a really loving, caring way, to use your term, is a really special trait that she has.
It's got to be like the greatest feeling there is when you see your kids grow up and mature and kind of take on leadership roles. And we're going to touch on why you were in the hospital here in a second. But I want to focus on another element that eventually led you there, although that wasn't the reason why. You get hired as the CEO of United Airlines, like massive job, right? You get this huge job and you decide to go on a listening tour to learn, right? Which flows very well with a show called The Learning Leader Show, right? That's what it's all about, like being a good listener, understanding what your people are going through, empathizing, like being compassionate, and just like living in their shoes. And so you're in the middle of this tour. Can you first, before we get to the second part of this, first tell me why that was part of your strategy at the beginning of your role? Because I'm sure there were a million priority lists, and having you out of the office during that listening tour just let some of those items continually stack up. And I'm sure others in the office said, hey man, we need you back here, yet you're on the road to listen. Can you share why you decided to do that?
Yeah, a couple different things. I think I have a mantra that I think I made up for myself, but everyone shares it. It's concept of listen. And I always say, no, really, truly listen, and then learn, and only then can you lead. And the implication there is the genuine listening is important in that you really do hear people. It's not like a checkbox. And then the learning aspect adds a little angle that says, what did you hear? What did you think you heard? And go back to those same people. It's like, hey, did I get this right, Ryan? And you find often that you don't. And then from that, you can get a real sense of where to go after that. Its genesis partly heritage, growing up with a large family, and we had to communicate effectively, but also experience. I've gone through many a transformation in my life and career, different jobs, different companies, different roles. And every time I have a little bit more experience, I look back at what I could have done different or better. And time after time after time, it's like, gosh, you know what? If I only knew then what I know now, that concept. And it's like, well, dummy, there's no reason why you shouldn't have known, because all it would have taken. An example is, going from a chief financial officer in a corporation to a COO, an operational person. When I was CFO, I was a smart kid with a lot of finance stuff, and you needed something for your business as an operator. We went through the systems and the process and the paperwork, and got to get an IRR and ROI and NPV and all those sorts of things. And I was doing my job, and operational people tend to get a little frustrated with that sometimes. And so the concept was, when I eventually rose in the ranks and got that COO job, and I was going through the operational aspects that you have to, and I'm realizing, dang it, I wish I had done this with my operational peer at the time, understanding what he or she needed, and it would have been a much different process. We would have proved some things, we would have done it differently, but that concept, like, why didn't I do that then? And that's kind of, for me, the genesis of this listen and learn. Because had I want and listened and paid attention, walked a mile in their shoes, so to speak, I would have learned a lot, and we would have been much more productive than having a somewhat confrontational aspect of that. And then the leadership part was clear, because it's like, once you're never going to have unanimity and everyone in consensus on these things. But you know what? If you involve enough people and you ask their input and you do it in a genuine way, and you remind them that not everything they say is going to be done, people are often worried about listening because, oh my God, am I in effect promising people, that I'm going to do all this? It's impossible to do all those things. But a human being, after being listened to, is a good feeling. Hey, somebody gives a crap about what I think. Second, I understand that not everything I have is going to be done, but then whenever it comes to be as a direction, it's like, hey, I had a hand in it, and so I have some ownership. I'm part of this. He involved me. That is a part that people don't often really truly comprehend as a leader, because I have 100,000 employees literally over 70 different countries. There is no factory floor for me to message to them and get their input. It has to be done on the fly and in the field. And that's another meaningful part. You go to where they are in their place, in their own place of work, they tend to be much more responsive, because you're there with them. And, a lot of times people will say, it's just another guy coming around asking questions, and nothing ever happens of this. And I was always able to very nicely respond. It's like, that might have been true in the past, but you really, at 2:00 in the morning, standing on top of a picnic table in a maintenance ramp in Houston, in this particular case, the CEO of the company has been here at this time asking you these types of questions. And the answer was no. And so for me, in that environment, in the situation we faced, was a really meaningful thing for me to do. So learned it on the fly by experience, been able to develop it. And it's something I teach and tell people quite a bit.
It seems obvious now looking back. Why do you think it's not the norm?
I think we, especially as leaders and senior leaders, you have this perception of, you're the man now, and you should know everything. And by acknowledging that maybe you don't know everything, or you need more input or more education, it seems to kind of sort of bring down the kind of person that you are. And in fact, when I announced my listening tour at an earnings conference, like, what's going to be your first thing? What's your priority? So, you know what? I'm going to spend 90 days really listening to the people that run this business, that service you as customers, and really learn from them as much as I can, so to be able to develop the right strategy going forward. Well, as you can imagine, Wall Street was not all too keen on that. Customers wanted to say, wait, how, and so it's one of those things that's not always the right course, but it was the right thing for our company at the time. Because to your point earlier, I had stacks of information, consultants report, everybody had an idea of what needed to be done. What I've learned in turnarounds, everything's broken, or most things are broken. Correctly determining the right first thing to start is a really big point, because then you have an infrastructure, a base to really launch all your other things for. You know, you could have done something brilliantly strategic, but you wouldn't have had the humans. I didn't go into this, gee, the people are disenchanted and disenfranchised and disengaged. I kind of knew something, but when I went out and listened, oh boy, it's like, I've figured this out. If we don't recapture their hearts and minds, nothing we do is ever going to work. And so I only learned that from this listening concept. And so again, many people can do it in different ways. I think the genuine nature of how you listen and how you respond and then lead is probably what makes the difference. Because you're right, people say this stuff all the time. They just don't really know how to do it, or they do it briefly, right? It's like walk around, do the checkbox. Yeah, I visited Station X and I got some input. Yeah, no, it's not always that. It's not easy.
It feels like it stems from ego too. I remember working for a newer boss who came in and he was at a very high level senior exec. And one of the things I said is, hey, I was new here at one point too. And you just kind of have to humble yourself and go around knowing that you're going to be in rooms. I worked in sales. And so you're going to be in rooms with people where you know the least amount, well, at least about this product and about the sales process, whatever it may be. So you just got to listen, take notes, ask questions, try to learn. And I remember this big ego boss saying like, I'm not doing that, like, because it would make him look less powerful and make him look less knowledgeable. He couldn't be like, have all of the answers. And I think to you, it speaks a lot to your humility and willingness to be a learner. Where does that stem from? Is that from your upbringing? I read all these amazing words you wrote about your mom. Where does this come from, this humility, especially because coming from where you came from, which we'll get to, and rising to how you've risen, it would be very understandable if you had a giant ego. In a way, it was earned based on your work, but you seem to be the opposite of that, which whenever I come across someone, I'm fascinated. So I'm curious where that comes from.
Yeah, I think nuance throughout my pages is hopefully an observation and an example of how diversity and inclusion can work for all of us. Because I'm not the first immigrant to come to America and make something of themselves, right? We hear that story increasingly more. But what we don't always comprehend is the roots of the heritage that we have, the roots of who we are and how we are raised, often translated to how we become, adults and how we do things like leadership. And so I grew up in incredibly humble circumstances for sure. But throughout that, the examples around me were just really hardworking folks, union folks. My dad was a union meat cutter. My mom was, my grandmother was a maid in a hotel. And observing as a youngster, those people, how genuine, how prideful they were of their work, how well-meaning they were in everything they did, but how frustrated it could be to try and do the jobs the way they wanted to, but somebody in senior management, right, the suits, that had different views and never really, quote, got it. So I kind of had a sense of that to a large degree. I had an uncle who was a huge union organizer, which is interesting because, me being the complete opposite in management. But I got to, again, it's empathy. It's back to this kind of, I was listening and learning without even knowing I was doing that back in the day. And then, from my heritage aspect, being Mexican-American, we have a term we always use, La Familia. And of course, family, right? Oh, yeah, family. Everybody talks about, but it is a special root in Latin heritage because it goes beyond bloodlines, right? It's just everyone is a tío or a tia, uncle or aunt. Everyone's a cousin, there's no borders between actual blood relationships, and everybody treats each other. You'll do anything for family becomes a broader context. So all of those little things I think have grown up inside me, and so for me, honestly, always being kind of the youngest to do things, I frankly was always a little bit of the youngest person everywhere. So I didn't know everything. But over time, I had a lot of coaching and guidance from folks to just relax. I have a term called swing easy. Don't try to hit the ball out of the park every single time. And then the concept of listen and learn really came out of that.
It feels like you just never forgotten where you've come from.
Again, I always hesitate from saying things like that because so many people say them. And I don't know that I would characterize it that. I have deep and profound gratitude for people along the way that somehow I kept my door open, so to speak. And even when people, when I didn't have it open, I remember taking a big job at a very young age and thinking that was all that. And back to our early conversation, I use the term, I came in all asses and elbows, man. It's like, hey, you know who I am? You retain, so you should do that. Then you look around you and you realize that there's a lot of people with a lot of experience. But I had a boss that basically said, hey, you're doing great. I took a chance on you. You're doing better than expected. He goes, but I'm like, oh, this doesn't sound right. Because, but you're not yet as good as you think you are. And I'm like, that didn't sound like a compliment. And obviously it's like, listen, I was way ahead of myself and I learned to slow down and observe the people around me. The people that I went from Pepsi to Coke. And so it's like going from New York City to Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, there's a difference in how people act. And people were much more senior at Coke. So in my world, everybody at Pepsi was young and hard charging. So I thought, oh my God, look at this place. But it's older people walking around. Oh, as I stopped and slowed down, I realized that the woman that looked like my aunt was a Harvard MBA, not 20 years ago, but Harvard MBA. It's like I didn't have one of those. And you learn by experience and allowing people around you to care for you. As a term, sharing is caring. You realize if people aren't sharing with you, that means you've given them a sense that you don't care about what they think. So guess what? Like they're gonna let you go or drive off a cliff if you'd like. So, so many life experiences, and that's why I'm glad what you do with your podcast. And it's such wonderful to hear these perspectives from so many people because experience does make a difference in these matters.
Well, let's go back to your listening tour. And in the middle of it, you're in Chicago, you go for a run, you're an avid runner, you're in good shape, still are. And at the end of this run, you decide to sprint, right? Which I love. I love reading about that. Like, I'm going to finish this, it's just a whatever 5-mile run, but I'm going to finish hard. You finish and you go back up to your kind of where you were living, temporary housing as you were the new CEO. And I read that you felt funny. What happened next?
This is a little bit of a public service announcement, so allow me to kind of expand a little bit more.
Sure.
Just from a standpoint of, the heart disease in America is the largest killer by far anything else. And most of us don't know anything about this necessarily unless you're personally touched. And many of us are personally touched. So while I had just rode a 100-mile bike race 2 weeks prior. I had run marathons before. I was a vegan of all sorts, supporting one of my sisters who's going through cancer treatment. So that was my level of support. And so, like most weekend athlete types, trying to keep in shape. But I have a friend who's a cardiologist who a couple of years before, and in one of our training runs or rides afterwards, he was always telling us stories about the OR. And he would say things like, you'd be surprised at how relatively young and fit some of the people that die on my operating table are. And it was like, we're just dudes hanging out and not worried about this stuff, but it's a good concept to listen and understand. But he would go on to say that most of the reasons why people do that is they disregard symptoms and they don't pay attention to things. And guys are particularly notable of this, right? We feel something that's kind of weird or funny. We'll figure it out later. And so what he said, it's like, if you ever feel anything weird, call 911. The worst that you can be is a little embarrassed that you had indigestion or something, but it could save your life. And it's like, we would kind of nod our heads, like, yeah. But then he said something that was pretty dramatic. Is, by the way, when you call 911, immediately tell them where you are. I'm like, well, duh. I mean, I got someone to do that. And then he said, because you may not make it past the phone call. And I remember thinking, looking, I was like, okay, that's a little dramatic, Mark. And it was, but fast forward 2 years later, I go on this run, I'm coming back, I'm making my vegan protein shake, my phone buzzes across the room, I go to get it, and on my way there, I feel weird, and then my legs kind of give out, and I'm a little clammy, and these words come rushing back that said, okay, this feels weird. This isn't, it wasn't a big run, it wasn't, it's something I was used to. And then I kind of crawled, not to my cell phone, but to my landline, which some of your listeners may not understand or remember what that was, but there's these weird systems with that are fastened to your wall. And I called 911 and immediately told them where they were, realized quickly that I had locked my front door, and in an apartment building, usually only have one floor, somehow crawled back, fell on the way, I suspect, and then opened the door to watch two EMTs come in right at that moment. And 37 days into the job, this happened. 37 minutes from this occurrence, I was on life support system, a heart-lung machine, where I put in a medical coma, and eventually end up, in a major heart issue and failure, and then eventually a heart transplantation a few months later. And so, that's what happened. And then the story is, and I enjoy telling that story because somewhere in your listener group, somebody will take that story and will tell their parent, their brother, their sister, their friend. And we still to this day get hundreds and hundreds of notes. People stop me at hotels and airports, and sometimes in tears, and says, I heard your story and I told my dad who would never do this, or my brother, or my husband. And so it's a little PSA, but at the same time, it's a meaningful one, because but for that, I would not be here.
Wow. I appreciate you sharing that. Could save somebody's life, legitimately, most likely will, which is amazing just to think about the scope and the scale and the reach here. But I had read that in between the heart attack and then having your heart transplant, that you were working, you were interviewing people to be senior members of your leadership team at United. I mean, from your apartment, I guess. What was that like? I mean, you trying to figure out, like, I almost died, I'm still waiting on a heart, right? You needed a transplant, so you're in this stage that I can't really relate to. I have not had that happen. What's going through your mind? But you're also thinking, I'm the new CEO, I got to do my job. I mean, this is just a wild dichotomy of things you have going on.
It's there's always a story behind these things, but briefly, the mind is an amazing tool. Despite all that happened, despite what I just told you, and even more, and I was a mess, I didn't feel that way. And so I was like, put me in, coach, put me back in. And so once I stabilized a little bit, I was able to have a little bit more broader conversations. But the real, I think, driving moment for me, and this goes back to the listening tour and gaining trust that had happened beforehand, and being engaged and creating a relationship with so many people, 100,000 employees, the letters that began to pour into my apartment of well wishes, come back, flowers, food, all of these things were coming, and banners were coming in volumes that they had to be carried in bags by my kids to the hospital room, because I was under a pseudonym at the hospital. Nobody wanted to know where I was. And the mornings became sort of, morning mail time. Doctors and nurses would come in, and my kids would read these notes from people I had never met, but somehow they had heard from me from the listening tour. You talk to one person, they talk to 20 people, and 20 people talk to 20 people. So there was this sense of connectivity, the sense of, we want you back, please get well. And that's what really drove my kind of work efforts, to your question. It's like, I'm coming back. I don't know what all this is, but I'll figure it out. And I'm coming back because, in my conversations and in these notes, it just completely confirmed and ratified that these humans who had been disengaged, disenfranchised, through all of the things that they've been going through in the company, I knew that their pride, professionalism, back to the people I met with my grandmother. And I was like, they want to do well. They just need somebody to lead them out of this desert. And that combination, it's like, well, let's get to work. And it's like, I can take phone calls, I can take people. And my mind was still there. And that's what kind of drove a lot of that. And the location and all that just became happenstance. And we just, it was a place to do it. And it was fun. I had this device on me, and people were kind of interested in, like, who's this guy? What's he doing? I heard all this. Oh, he looks fine. So it was fun, and we made some very productive business decisions in that time frame on top of all that.
When you got the job, the culture prior to you becoming the CEO was one of cost cutting. It was rule obsessed. and it was a disciplinary heavy culture. And you learned a lot of that on that listening tour. I don't think it's abnormal when a senior leader gets fired and the next one comes in that they have to clean up a mess. And you certainly did. Quite a mess that you were faced with lots and lots of people. One that some might say, God, there's got to be easier jobs out there, right, than trying to turn that thing around that was rule obsessed and all about cost cutting and just discipline heavy culture, right, of how you're treating people. When you see that, what are you thinking in that moment, and how do you even begin to try to turn that around, because it's such a massive ordeal that you found yourself in?
Every circumstance would have its approaches and tactics, but by being aware of people and this listening concept, I had a sense that our employee base wasn't with us. The union contracts hadn't been signed for some folks. They'd been very contentious and ugly. So, you always saw the placards and the picket lines. And so, union management was 80% of the corporation wasn't happy. It was pretty obvious. How disengaged and disenfranchised is what I began to learn. And importantly, what you learn during these listening things, the reasons they were disengaged, disenfranchised, and all that was certainly the contract to some degree, but it was petty little stuff that just seemed to accumulate, that just made them feel less like part of the company and more just kind of an outsourced aspect, which we were attacking their humanity, their reason for being. It's like you are reducing me to nothing but a number. And that, in a service-oriented world, which we have, which you see every day when you fly, and in a world where there is no oversight, I am not there. No leader is there when they're interacting with you on the phone, at the gate, where you're buying all right. People in my industry have to feel a connection to this, have to feel the reason why they need to be these things. And we have lost that completely in so many ways. And so how you go about it is like, the more you understand, it's like, wow. And so I asked my team one specific tactic. It's like, can you all outline for me the 10 dumbest rules we've put in place over the last couple of years? And like, what do you mean? It's like, I'm telling you, just the stupidest things that we've done that make no sense. And we came back obviously with more than 10, but we narrowed it down to a few and then began to get right at them. And I'll tell you, the things that we fixed weren't monumental, but it began to say, hey, did you hear what he did? He heard me on this, right? And I know we don't have enough time to go through some of the silliness that we did, but one of them, we removed the styrofoam cups from coffee machines for cost reasons. You're like, okay, like that's just like, it's like, remove the coffee. I don't like that concept, but that seems like it's a cost-cutting effort and it sucks. But but no, leave the coffee, but take the cups away. I mean, you're just like, how much can cup? So it was things like this to items where one or two occurrences, sort of the rotten apple, had spoiled the whole bunch. So we took a couple aspects and then really revamped how people could travel. And one of the things that the airline industry does for people is allows you to travel for free. There's a lot of restrictions and all that, but we have a huge diverse workforce. You weren't allowed to fly your parents in from another country without you being there, which means you would have to go there, bring them back, go back and take them there, which made no sense. And it was because we had two occurrences of somebody selling that sort of thing. So those little actions just sent waves of affirmation that said, hey, maybe this guy actually does matter about these things. And it was, again, and they were simple, easy things to do, right? We had much harder work to be done, but in order to do that work, you had to regain the trust of a lot of those employees.
Well, it feels like you understood that we work in a service-based business, and it starts with your team before you're going to go external to your customers, right? So, because if you don't treat your team with respect and don't listen to them and don't try to make changes on their behalf to make the place a better place to work, they're not going to then outwardly do great work, right? So it feels like you started with, hey, what are the dumb things we do here, guys? Okay, what are some of the dumb things? Let's just get some quick wins here and fix some of these stupid things that we do. And then slowly and gradually we start showing our people we're going to take care of you. We think about you. We are going to try to actively make your life better, your work life better. And by doing so, hopefully then you have a happier workforce who then, when they are talking to your customers, they have a sense of pride of where they work, right? As opposed to saying like, well, this place sucks and there's a lot of dumb rules. I'm here just to cash a check. I can't wait till my shift is over. I don't care how I'm going to treat these customers. I just want to get out of here.
You know, it's there's, and this is a part of my pages, of course, because one of the watershed moments during this listening tour is I'm getting all this input and feedback, and exactly what you just outlined is happening. And I am a little troubled. I'm hearing so much from so many different places that I'm like, okay, big guy, you signed up to come back with thoughts, specific thoughts to put into action. And I was confused. There was so much information and data. And there's this flight coming back from Denver to Chicago, where I went into the front galley to talk to the flight attendants. And again, my listening tour wasn't profound. It wasn't a survey. It wasn't, broad question. It wasn't these real intellectual questions. I just consultants like, hey, what's up and what's going on?
And there was no entourage, I read, right? It was just you. Like you weren't flying private. You were flying coach commercial. You were on your own planes. And it was just you. It wasn't like this huge entourage of a group. Oh, there's a CEO. There's a new big guy. Let's go. It wasn't like that.
There was always a nervous supervisor or manager of an organization that would sit there and watch me take a lot of flack from all these people and being a little worried for my health. But no, it was this, again, it's back to this concept of listening. Like you and I just talking here, we're apt to tell more. So I go into this galley, and Amy Sue, and I know her well, I asked her the question like, hey, how's it going? And I could see in her face, you could see the wanting to just let a lot of stuff out. But we're on a flight, and this guy, does he really care about this stuff? And I kind of touched her gently, and I said, oh, please. I mean, I'm really trying to learn, right? It's how you get something out of someone. And she broke down in tears and said the magic words that were part of United's, turnaround. She says, Oscar, I'm just tired of always having to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we're late. I'm sorry the coffee sucks. I'm sorry you can't sit. If you think about the things that we face sometimes, because of all the rules and all the policies and all the procedures, which are there for reasons, you begin to constrict an ability, a human person, to do something for another. And if you have to do it every day and you have no control over it, that can suck, right? That's what really disengaged. And for me, that was the bright, shining light that went off in my head. It's like, oh, I get it. We've made these people work so hard to do. They don't trust us. They're just like, nothing's ever going to get better. We can bring better coffee. We can serve filet mignon to everyone, but it's never going to matter because these people are disengaged. So that's where my first thing is like, we have lost the trust of our very own employees. And before we do anything, if we don't regain it. Now, the trick from a leadership perspective, me thinking that and knowing that, now I had to convince all my senior leaders, because it wasn't going to be easy, because they're used to putting rules and procedures. Just tell them what to do. It's easier to do those things. So I knew there was going to be a big, long journey, but at least in my mind, I had this revelation that's like, I think I know where I'm headed. Like literally, like, thank God. Got home and a couple of weeks later, had this heart attack. So, we had to put off some of that work for a little bit, but that's how that story went.
Speaking of your senior leaders that you had to convince and talk to and shift out of this command and control style with rules, you were in the process, like I said, between having the heart attack and the transplant, you were interviewing people to play significant roles, senior leadership roles. I'm curious, Oscar, what are some of the must-have qualities in a person to get hired to be a leader on your team?
Oh gosh, there's so many things. I think there is a great need in the business that I was running, that it's important for people to be able to follow my lead to some degree on this concept of listening and learning before leading. And so I will check for my interviews, and as people will tell you, start with almost 15, 20 minutes of, hey, Ryan, tell me about yourself. I don't want to hear your resume. I always say, stop, don't go past high school. Because people will go, oh, I was born in St. Louis, and I went to college, and I got these 18, great jobs. It's like, tell me about your mom and dad, brothers and sisters. What were the influences in high school? Did you play sports? Did you, were you in drama or music or whatever? Tell me about, those sorts of things. And the tenseness and the emotion just lays down, and you begin to see a real person in front of you. And from that vantage point and their experiences and how they share them, I glean a lot. Is this person have an ability to be humble, to be genuine, to have empathy and understand others? And above all else, as we get to the second section of the interview about their abilities, how you listen to how they talk. Oh, I did this and I did this and my whole thing. And I'll push a little bit and say, oh, so, did you have people around you? And so you always get this concept of being a collaborative person. And then there's always this, you need a sense of urgency, and it's something I call proof, not promise. Tell me what you did versus what you promised, right? We know that term, most of us, probably from a level of politicians, right? When they're running for office, there's, we're going to fix everything, right? Homeless activity is going to go away. And what is the proof? And I think one of the things that I find from a legacy perspective, two things. One, if you talk to someone at United who's been there for a while, you're flying, and you say, hey, I just talked with Oscar on my podcast, I 100% guarantee you're going to get a smile and a warm thing that just says, I remember I knew Oscar. I may have not known that person, but they knew me. The second thing, this concept of proof, not promise. And, I've tested it. I have never said anything from a promise perspective that we didn't deliver on. When I talk with you, and I would tell you, it's like, I don't think I can do that. So there's plenty of that for sure. But when we set out on something to do, this concept of proof, not promise. So, it's a broad answer to your question, because it's, we're always looking for the one or two things. When interviewing a person that's going to become part of your family, in essence, you need to get a sense of who they are and where they come from, and then test in your own way how human they are to do this. Their intellect, their capabilities, their history is all laid out in their CV and their resume. You've seen it. People that get certainly to the CEO office, they don't come because they haven't accomplished anything. So I had that luxury, knowing that I didn't have to probe into that too deeply unless needed to. But really, can they fit in with this team, this family that we're building, was probably my biggest driving point.
So it feels like you cared deeply about their character and the type of person they are. Just to get practical for a second here, for people who are
Sure.
doing this right now, what was the process like? I mean, everyone's got different interview processes. Like this is how it starts, and this is how we get to the offer. What was it like from beginning to end of? And I know at that level that you're at, they don't get to you unless they're awesome, right? You rarely are going to have an interview where you're like, how did this person get to me? I'm sure that doesn't happen very much, because they had to go through many steps just to get to you. But from that point on, then what's it like to become like a CFO or the COO, which are jobs that you're hiring for?
This, as you might expect, I am a big believer in this 10 heads are better than one. And
Yeah.
I can't possibly be the smartest person in the room, and getting input from many others provides for such greater solutions. And so what I've always enabled in all my organizations from early on is this concept of no one person, including the CEO, gets to hire any one other person without other people around. So to this day, there's a process at United and process at CSX. I don't know where that is because it's been a while, but anybody that rose to a point where we're about to make an offer or getting to the point has the sort of express approval from a broader group of people. So it's not just my view or my process or my concept of how I test their character and humility and those sorts of things. There's been a lot of people that have been involved, and all of those voices get brought in. So when you get promoted at United, you've gone through the entire executive leadership team. And that does two things. It rules out the earlier charges when I was doing my listening of basically cronyism. The only way you get ahead of here is if you know Bill and Bob and Mary and those sorts of things. But this aspect of getting everybody's input is a really important part, because my style and my approach is mine, and it does me. But there's pieces missing, and we've had many an occurrence with the senior folks that we've gone through it, and then there's repetition. You go away from the office, you go have lunch or dinner with them somewhere. I've had, meetings in hotel rooms. I just everywhere that you can, where you find the candidate in a relaxed or unrelaxed, it doesn't matter, environment, because that's how life is, right? Life doesn't get to be with all bright, shining lights and the right microphone in front of you. Life happens real time, real places, and getting a sense of them when they're sort of in that mode is a really important message for me.
Yeah, man, it felt like through tragedy, it made it of your mother passing away, it forced you to pause for a second and reflect. And I sense that in a weird way, you became more comfortable in your own skin. You became more authentic and real. And you say, let people in. I would gather one of the ways you let people in is by being more vulnerable. One of my friends, Jason Gaynard, says relationships move at the speed of vulnerability. And to me, it feels like that's where the shift was. And then the result ended up being, I would imagine, great results where you worked, as well as great relationships. And then that led to you continually getting promoted in your career.
Yeah, that's a nice recap, and I love that aspect, that vulnerability aspect, and how that builds a relationship. Because no one's going to trust you unless they feel you trust them, and vice versa. And so that's an important people to understand.
You use the phrase common metal. I never heard that before. And you can describe what common metal means, but United had acquired the airline Continental. I didn't even really remember Continental being an airline, but I started studying more, and it's like, oh, wow, okay, this is a big deal. So United had acquired them. So you merged. This is before your time as the CEO. And I believe it was like 5 years into that acquisition, and they still weren't fully integrated properly. And then you become the CEO. And I think this is not at that scale. That's not relatable to a lot of people. But what is relatable is having to kind of merge teams or to bring on new people and make them feel part of the team. That is more relatable. Walk me through that. What was going on with this common metal, as well as the Continental people feeling like they were other in a way, and how you worked to make everybody feel as one team?
So two things. The concept of common metal is the way airlines work is you get a certificate to fly. You get to fly certain aircraft, which is dubbed metal, right? So think of metal as an aircraft. So my certificate allows me to fly my aircraft. Your certificate allows you to that. And we merge together. So the trick is to get a joint certificate so that both our aircrafts and all our crews can fly on either airplane. But without labor negotiations being finalized, you could not fly on each other's airplanes. So you as a customer would be sitting there delayed on a United flight, because you didn't have crew, but then you'd be observing a host of flight attendants sitting right next to you, because they were United flight attendants, not Continental, so they couldn't fly. So that, operationally just was a disaster of epic proportions. To your point with regards to on a more normal basis, how you bring groups together. What I used at United was simply, people come from where they come, because they have that history and that heritage. United for so many years, right? The Friendly Skies, Rhapsody in Blue was an iconic brand in America. But then they had their tough moments, bankruptcy, like many others. Continental was more of in its heyday at the time, and was really sort of operating much better. So from a Continental perspective, hey, we're here, our senior team's there, we're better than you. I mean, look at the numbers. And the United folks are much bigger, have a deeper history, and have a great tradition of things. And we had to make a decision on what to call the new company, United or Continental. And United clearly won because it had global reach and it was the right brand to use. But you have a lot of people inside just pissed off at each other. And there's a lot of, I am sub United and I'm sub Continental or ex Continental. And so there was a lot of that divide constantly, a little bit like what you see in our country today with regards to that. And it doesn't fare well for anyone. So first and foremost, I very clearly laid down the line and said, if you're going to introduce yourself to me, love it, want to talk to you about anything and everything. If you start your conversation and, well, I'm sub-United or I'm ex-Continental, and then you have negative things to say, it's going to be a really short conversation. I'm happy to hear what you have to say. Don't dub it from, in essence, I'm right and they're wrong and I can't believe they're doing this, A. And then B, really sharing the story of the heritage and pride that they both had and getting the others to understand. And so, by the way, their pride comes from a real good source. United was a great company. Continental was a great company. So how do we become a great one? So you explain, you build bridges across those sorts of things. And then the next step, the tactical step, was solving all of these labor negotiations and all these contracts so that we can indeed not only fly physically on common metal, but begin to, in a metaphorical way, fly together as opposed to flying sort of apart. And so we all face those integrated pieces. How do you bring people from different pods and environments? You just have to be aware of it. It's human dynamics. Usually people aren't being jerks just to be jerks. They're usually being jerks because they feel someone else is kind of accosting them. So try not to use those terminologies of the way we used to do it. And then again, it's back to the listening. It's like people don't do the things they do because they're stupid or they're ignorant. They do things the way they do because they've been taught that way. It's worked before. And if you ask the question, it's like, gee, Oscar, that's new to me. Tell me why you do what you do the way you do it. But understanding where and why someone does something, there's a term, seeking first to understand before being understood. It's back to my asses and elbows thing. It's like you can walk in and say, okay, you're stupid, you're flailing, let me tell you how to do this. And over time, we were able to meld the two greatest things about those two companies to have the turnaround that we were able to have at United.
And throughout the course of time of being a CEO of any company, you're going to have adversity strike. It happens all the time, right? That's just part of the deal. And I think one of the big ones that came out in the news is when a United team like forcefully took somebody, carried a guy off a plane. I vaguely remember this. And I'd read that people didn't like your statement after this gentleman got pulled off of a plane years ago. What happened with that story, and how did you initially deal with it and get big time criticized and then respond to that criticism?
Removing the passenger customer is an understatement. He was physically assaulted and dragged off the aircraft, kicking and screaming. A violent video that went viral in pretty much every country in the world. I think it's been between 500 and 800 million views on Weibo, which is the Chinese, social media system of that, because they thought he was a Chinese individual. He was actually Vietnamese. So the event was horrible, horrific in every sense of the word. Interestingly, what complicated the matter is that it wasn't a bunch of United folks doing this. In fact, there was no United employee engaged or involved. And in fact, it wasn't a United aircraft. It was one of our regional partners that carries our name, but it's a separate company. And so whether it's the Chicago Police Authority at the airport, whether it's other folks, the situation involved employees of another company, not necessarily ours. And the only United employee was the supervisor who was sitting there at the door watching the same thing we all watched on the video. So that complication led to a lot of folks that advise a CEO on what to say and how to say it, saying, oh, we got to be careful. How do we figure out how to tell the right story? That in fact, it wasn't United, it was other people. And so we were going through that process. The initial response was on Twitter. Now, we think of Twitter in a very significant way. Back in 2017, not that long ago, it wasn't a thing. I don't know this for a fact, but United may be the first sort of negative viral thing that came out of Twitter because we didn't understand. My team didn't understand. Somebody had responded earlier in the morning about something that we had been overbooked. And then when I'm going through this and didn't understand what Twitter would mean and what we respond, it's like, well, we came with the term reaccommodated. for beating the crap out of a human being, right?
Mm.
That's what created the sort of the divide. But we didn't understand how far a reach that would be. And so immediately the negativity came back. Quickly realized what we did. To add to the drama, the individual involved, the customer, had a past that maybe wasn't the best. So people are trying to say, hey, listen, this wasn't a normal. There's just a whole host of things going on there, and so we're going to go on TV. I'm going to go on TV. Good Morning America, millions. I don't know how many millions they get, but it's half the nation is going to be watching this because this. I'm glad you don't remember it, but many people have not forgotten that, and I get this question a lot. It was a big topic, and so you can imagine the producers of the show cannot wait to get a CEO in front of a camera, beginning to spin his way out. Well, you have to understand how this works, and it wasn't us, it was this, and in essence, blaming others. This is in the moment, and I describe this because it's important for me from my upbringing and my heritage. And, we talk about my mom and my grandmother and this and how they raised me and what they would do. I remember in the middle of the night after being coached for, hours on end beforehand on how to effectively get on TV and tell the story we wanted to tell that made United look, in essence, not culpable to a degree for many reasons. That night, I couldn't sleep. And I fell on my knees. I think Lincoln said it, not because I'm a pious person necessarily, but there was nowhere else to look, and you approach this, it's like, I don't know what to ask, but, it didn't feel right. And in that moment, I realized that what I was going to say the next morning, I didn't know the exact word necessarily, but it wasn't going to be what everybody wanted me to say. So I get up in the morning, I get up and I get in this thing, and everybody, everything's all set up in the studio, and tough questions start firing. And I just respond saying, it was a horrific event. It should have never happened, but it did happen on my watch. I hold myself responsible. We let policies and procedures, and we talked about that earlier, Ryan, with regards to we were so rules conscious. We let policies and procedures get in the way of doing the right thing for another human being, and that should never happen, period. And here are the things we're going to do immediately to correct all of that and other things. And an amusing part was, I don't know what was louder, the gasp from my team, legal and PR wise, like, wait, he's not supposed to say that. Or the producers in her ear, like, they're waiting for me to start using any kind of, sort of pointing of fingers. And then the beauty of it is a lesson to all is the truth, while it can hurt initially, is a truth that's repeatable. In my heart, I knew I would have to answer this question literally for the rest of my life. And any kind of spin aspect of that was going to be, sort of awkward. So, you know what? I'm going to take this on, take it personally. A lot of negative feedback from that necessarily, but we got it past it. We fixed all the things that we need to do. It's never happened again. And it's become, all the big business schools have a case on this, on how things can go so wrong, and then how things can get right and even get better. What happened to that person should have never happened.
I do think people like to forgive and give another shot
Sure,
if
sure.
they
If.
sense it's genuine
Yeah.
and you're telling the truth.
Yeah.
If not, you're dead. Like
Yeah.
it's not working. But I think for the most part, most people, if you are genuine and authentic and you don't take it as like, look at me, I'm the CEO, I'm taking the blame. You do it like in a genuine way, which is what, you did. People are able to accept that and move on. But when they sense any type of being inauthentic, it doesn't work. I think it's a good learning as a husband and a dad and trying to, do great work, right? Certainly not lead 100,000 people like you did at United, but I am curious about how you managed to be a great husband and I read about like how you write about your wife and your kids, right? That's like some of my favorite parts. But you have such a demanding job, and you had demanding jobs for a long time, which in your case, you got to be there. Like you physically have to be present a lot for the jobs that you've had. You can't do this work from home stuff. So how did you manage being a great husband and great dad, simultaneously being a great senior exec and CEO?
It's a profound question in so many ways, but we all have pressure-filled jobs, and I certainly don't count myself unique in that regard. So you kind of start with that, and I consider myself fortunate beyond belief in being able to have all of these roles and opportunities to kind of lead others. But I think most fathers and parents in general will understand kind of a simple fact that knowing that your kids are watching you deal with all of this crap, good stuff, bad stuff, and watching and in essence learning from you. It's this example aspect of that, how you balance all of these demands on life and adversity. I think it gave me the strength to actually do so. My dropping on my knees and thinking of my mom and my grandmother and what they would do in a very different world where they don't run companies, but knowing that the people most personal to me, more connected to me in my life, my family, were always watching, and what they would think always drove me. And so that continues to be sort of how I balance all of this, is that the people that are watching isn't the media, isn't all these folks. It's the people that matter most that are going to act upon that at some point in time in their life. And if you've led the right way and the right example, you hope that they will follow that. I think that's how I think about that situation.
Just being the great model, right? You behave, because they're going to catch and watch and see more than they're going to listen to any words. They're actually watching their dad. Your spouse is watching her partner. And that is what you thought about each day when you're spending a lot of time not with them.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Well, one more. Let's say you're meeting with someone who's fresh out of college, maybe early to mid 20s, and they say, Oscar, wow, your career, like, I'd love to kind of do so much good in the world as you've done. What are some general pieces of life/career advice you give to that person?
I'll rephrase some of the things that we've mentioned already. I think this concept of listen, learn, and lead. As a young person, I often have in rooms where we have newcomers and people that have been around for a while. And I always make a funny sort of anecdote. It's like, the older, more experienced folks are like, hey, give these people the time and give themselves the feedback that they need, and do it in a genuine way so they can, you should leave, your legacy should be you leave a better place than you left it. I learned that in the railroad system. And then I look at the young people and I look at them straight in the eye and I say, you know what, you guys just shut up and listen. Just shut up and listen. We come out of school with such great intellect nowadays and so much, and we're ready to go, but experience does count. Allow people around you to show you the way. My career is full of people pulling me aside saying, hey, have you ever thought about this, Oscar? And it's been so meaningful. You may have heard at the time. So that concept of listen and learn. The second is swing easy. We were talking about how people act and the deep voice and the trying to project something that you're not. Learn to be yourself. And just, if you watch professional golfers and tennis players, the way they go, baseball, any sport, the way they do things seems so effortless, yet so productive. And if we try too hard to do these things that we see other people doing, you're not necessarily being yourself. So learn to swing easy and kind of be yourself. And then remember the mantra that it's all about proof, not promise. You can get past all sorts of things by saying to your boss or people around you're going to do something, but quietly delivering the proof time and time again really accrues greatly to who you are as a person, but also who you are as a valued person. I think simple things like that, the earlier and quicker you can learn them. So many books about how to do so many things and getting people, above all else, when you read books, when you listen to things like this, look hard within yourself. It's like, is that me? And the simplest analog, it's like, if somebody tells you, oh, always start, a meeting with a joke. If you're a crappy joke teller, don't do that. Find something else, right? It's just, and so knowing yourself above all else would probably be my biggest thing. The quicker you can get to know yourself through others' lens, not your own, and what your mom and dad have taught you, it's what others say is a really meaningful thing. So know thyself would be my final answer.
I love it, Oscar, man. You're such a good dude. I really appreciate you being here. The book, which I highly recommend reading because it's written really well. It's amazing stories, and it was cool to just learn about you and your story. It's called Turnaround Time, Uniting an Airline and Its Employees in the Friendly Skies. Really well done. Really appreciate you being here, man. And I would love to continue our dialogue as we both
Love
progress,
to,
man.
love to, love to, love what you do. Really
Thank you.
appreciate it. And thank you. All right. Take care.
Thank you, Oscar.
All
Appreciate it,
right.
man.
Bye-bye.